Today we're looking at Matthew chapter 1. The genealogy, an account of the birth story of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Now remember from last week when we were talking about Matthew's community, I had said that it was probably located in Antioch. There was a large Jewish population there. And Matthew is careful to tell the story of Jesus, not to supersede, not to displace the tradition and the law and the prophets and the patriarchs. Because that grounding is so important. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's where the story of Jesus begins. Jesus is connected to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. He is connected to the story of God's promises and salvation that go way, way, way back to Abraham. There's a bunch of names here. A lot of begetten and begotten. It kind of feels like an Old Testament story. As we watch and walk through the names, you'll see that there are some that are famous, there are others that are infamous, there are those that are unknown. We're going to take a little look at some of the movement there. Now, it is mostly a story of men, because in a patriarchal world, the focus was on the father. And so it's not unsurprising that this genealogy is mostly men. But there are 5 women, and I want to take a quick look at who they are. We have Tamar. You might remember, she is the one whose husband dies, and her father-in-law, Judah, is unable to provide an heir for her. He refuses to do his duty by the law when she could not find another heir to bear a child to her dead husband. And so she dresses up like a prostitute, and there on the side of the road lures him. And after she is found to be pregnant, she reveals herself. And Judah declares that she is faithful. For even though he wouldn't provide an heir to her, she knows how to work through the system. And she is faithful. Tamar. Then we have Rahab. Now Rahab is a prostitute in Jericho, not dressing up like one for Halloween. Rahab is the faithful one that helps the spies as they come into Jericho. This is reminiscent of Jesus' ministry that reaches out to prostitutes and to those on the outskirts. After Rahab, we have Ruth. Ruth, if you might remember from the story of Naomi and Ruth, Ruth is faithful to her mother-in-law. She is from a foreign nation. And when her mother-in-law goes to return to her homeland after Ruth's husband have died, Ruth says, I will go with you. And Ruth becomes the grandmother of King David. Then we have the wife of Uriah. Now you might remember the story of Bathsheba. This is the big scandal, by the way, of the Davidic monarchy. King David, who is prized, who's lifted up on a pedestal. He notices that Bathsheba, well, she's quite a looker, and she is sunbathing on the other roof. He is filled with lust and desire, and so he sends her husband, Uriah, he sends him to the front of he's in the army, and so he sends him to the front of the battle line, and then he orders a retreat. And Uriah is killed. And then he's able to take Bathsheba for his own wife. The prophet will call David on it. And the history remembers that incident, even though it would be easier just to forget it. And so in this genealogy, we're lifted up that the wife of Uriah, David's scandal, is part of God's plan. Because to Uriah is born Solomon, and Solomon continues the line of kings. And finally, the last person, the very end of the story, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have the patriarchs, we have the women. Now let's just look at some of the movement of the story. We're told that there's 14 generations from Abraham to King David. And there's a bit of a progression there, for things are good in the land. But as we see with the wife of Uriah, the scandal of David, very soon the monarchy falls apart. The list of kings that follow David, they're bad kings, they're rogues. Israel's kings lead it into ruin. They're known in the history books, and they are portrayed. Now there are some exceptions. For instance, Josiah, Hezekiah, those are known as good kings, and what makes them good is they follow God's law. And just as Jesus himself will follow God's law throughout his ministry, he will teach, he will reinterpret that law. So do the good kings, but there are few and far between. The kings lead to Babylon. And Babylon is exile. Babylon is destruction for the people. From Babylon, there's 14 generations, we are told. And this group of people are unknown. We don't know who they are. There's no record of their leadership, their accomplishment. And yet, through these unknown people, the Messiah is born. Jesus, son of Joseph, linking all the way back through this whole story to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, son of Mary. 14 generations, one last thing. 14 before David, 14 between David and exile, 14 between exile and the birth of Jesus. If you add it up, it doesn't add up. Matthew is a horrible mathematician. In fact, if you actually read through the generations between, there are not 14. The years don't add up. But what does add up is that Matthew is concerned about this story of salvation. He sees it as something that fits together. It fits together with God's story and history of being with the people from the patriarchs to David, from the patriarchs through the Exodus, through the wandering in the wilderness to David, the history of the monarchy, the falling apart, down to Babylon, to exile, and then the return from exile, which ultimately leads to the Messiah. God's fingerprints are all over the place, and it fits together. That's what the 14 helps us to see, is that it fits together and it makes sense in the larger history. This week, I got a couple questions for you. If this is Jesus' family tree, what is yours? And where do you find God's fingerprints in your family history? Where are the grace moments, the story in your story that connect you with God's love for you? Who are some of the scoundrels, some of the imperfections, some of the branches that you might have sawn off the tree? And where do you find God's work even in spite of those things? Have a good week, and we'll see you again next week, where we'll look at Matthew chapter 2.